Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a topic that I find super fascinating, the Jesuits.
The Jesuits.
Uh-huh.
Oh, they've got a history, all right, and it's a long one.
Yeah, it's amazing how they've been around since the 1500s. I mean, think about that. And they're still going strong today. They've had their fingers in just about everything: education, missions across the globe, art, even politics, you name it. They've probably been involved somehow.
Their influence is pretty undeniable.
For sure. And to really get into it, we're using this book, The Jesuits, a history from Ignatius of Loyola to the present. It's a treasure trove of information.
I can't wait to see what we uncover.
Oh, I guarantee there'll be some surprises along the way. Like, did you know they were actually banned worldwide at one point?
Banned. Wow.
Yep, totally banned. And they almost went extinct, except for this crazy loophole in Russia that allowed them to survive.
A loophole. Talk about a close call.
Right. And then there's their whole pioneering role in modern schooling. They were revolutionaries in that sense, but they also stirred up a lot of controversy with their approach.
Their story is full of those kinds of twists and turns. It's amazing how a small group of friends ended up becoming such a global force.
Exactly. So let's go back to the beginning, to the first founding, with Ignatius of Loyola. Now, this guy was not your typical saint.
Not at all. He starts out as a soldier, gets badly injured, and then has this religious epiphany while he's recovering. But instead of, becoming a monk or something, he decides to go to university.
That's not the usual path to sainthood.
Nope. And it's interesting to think about how his early experiences as a soldier might have shaped his approach to spirituality. He wasn't about withdrawing from the world. Ignatius was all about engaging with it, using knowledge and education as tools to serve a higher purpose.
So picture Paris in the 1530s. You've got Ignatius and 6 other students.
What a crew. I'm picturing a very lively bunch.
I know, right? They make this vow to go to Jerusalem, but when that falls through, they offer their services to the Pope.
That was a pretty bold move.
Totally. And that leads to the formation of the Society of Jesus in 1540.
Which we know as the Jesuits.
Right. It seems simple enough, but I'm sure it wasn't all smooth sailing.
Definitely not. And from the start, they did things their own way. They didn't wear those distinctive robes or take on religious names. And their leader, the superior general, was elected for life. They even broke with tradition by not chanting the liturgical hours.
Wait, hold on. They skipped the chanting. That seems pretty radical for a religious order back then.
It definitely raised some eyebrows, but it showed that their priority was flexibility in ministry, rather than just rigidly sticking to old structures.
So from the very beginning, they were kind of rebels.
In a way, yes. And this adaptability, it became a hallmark of theirs. It helped them survive all those ups and downs they'd face over the centuries.
I love how those seemingly small choices can have such huge long-term consequences.
Absolutely. It's fascinating how history unfolds that way.
Okay, so Ignatius brings 2 big things to the table: the spiritual exercises and the idea of running schools. Now, the spiritual exercises, that's a guide to having a more personal, introspective religious life, and it became popular even with people outside of the Jesuit order, right?
Yes, people from all walks of life found it helpful. It resonated with them.
Yeah.
But their decision to focus on education, now that was truly revolutionary. Back then, education was mainly for the elite or for those going into the priesthood.
Right, it wasn't for everyone.
Exactly. The Jesuits saw it differently. For them, education was this powerful tool, not just for religious purposes, but for the good of society as a whole.
It's amazing how they saw education as a way to shape the future, not just the present. And by 1556, when Ignatius died, they already had schools popping up all over Europe.
They were definitely making their mark.
They were, but they were also starting to get some pushback, some criticism, like for things like encouraging frequent communion. Were they trying to shake things up on purpose, or were they just accidentally stepping on some toes?
Well, it's important to remember the context here. This was the time of the Reformation, a period of huge religious upheaval. The Catholic Church was under pressure to reform, to respond to the challenges from Protestantism.
Right, it was a turbulent time.
And the Jesuits, with their emphasis on personal spirituality and being active in the world, well, they were seen by some as too progressive, a threat to the old guard.
So they were kind of caught in the middle of this larger struggle within the church.
Exactly. Trying to find their own path during a very tumultuous period, and that tension, that back and forth between tradition and innovation, between loyalty to the church and a willingness to challenge its norms, well, it became a major theme in their history.
So they were kind of walking a tightrope.
They were, and it led to some amazing successes, but also some really intense conflicts.
Okay, so next up, they enter what's called their Golden Age. They become the schoolmasters of Europe, running over 150 colleges, some of which even became full-fledged universities. But they weren't just about books and lectures, right? They were deeply involved in culture, composing plays, music. They even ran printing presses and influenced the development of ballet.
It's remarkable how they managed to immerse themselves in the culture while still maintaining their religious identity.
It's like they were influencing society from all angles.
Exactly. And that gave them a unique perspective and a lot of influence, which of course would have some unexpected consequences later on.
It makes you think about how interconnected everything is. Their involvement in all these cultural things might have seemed separate from their religious mission, but it all played a role in their rise to prominence and the challenges they faced later.
You can definitely see those connections. Their actions had ripple effects, some intentional, some not. And their success in Europe was only part of the story. Their missionary work was taking off, reaching far corners of the world: India, Japan, Brazil, even China.
I can imagine those early Jesuit missionaries setting sail for unknown lands, facing all those dangers and challenges. It must have taken incredible courage and faith.
It did. And those missions weren't just about converting people to Christianity. They were about cultural exchange, scientific exploration, and learning from different ways of life. They brought back knowledge of geography, cartography, early anthropology. It really broadened European understanding.
So they're building this global network, gaining knowledge, influence. It sounds like they were on this amazing trajectory.
They were.
But you mentioned earlier that things weren't always easy. What were some of the bumps in the road during this time of expansion?
Well, as their influence grew, it also made them a target. Their involvement in global affairs led to accusations of meddling in politics, of being agents of foreign powers, and that got them kicked out of some places, like Venice. They were seen as a threat.
Wow, so they were playing a high-stakes game.
They were.
And did this political intrigue eventually lead to their downfall?
It definitely played a role. Success often breeds resentment. People saw them as a threat, and they were targeted because of it.
I can sense a shift in the narrative here. It sounds like their golden age might be coming to an end.
It was.
What else contributed to their decline?
Well, there were internal struggles, disagreements within the order. It created divisions and weakened their unity.
Like what?
Well, there was this attempt by a group of Spanish Jesuits to change how things were organized. It led to a lot of conflict and exposed some vulnerabilities in their leadership.
It makes you think about the human side of it all, you know? We tend to think of these historical events as inevitable, but real people were making these decisions, wrestling with doubts, trying to figure things out.
Exactly. And those internal struggles were made worse by external pressures. There was this fake manual, the Monita Secreta, that was spread around, accusing them of using shady tactics to gain power and wealth.
Wait, a fake manual?
Yeah, total fabrication. But even though it was proven false, it still damaged their reputation.
So fake news even back then?
You can say that.
Yeah.
It shows how easily misinformation can be used to hurt people, even throughout history.
It definitely highlights the need to be critical and look at the motives behind those accusations. So this fake manual, that wasn't the only controversy, right?
No. They also got tangled up in theological disputes, most notably the one with the Jansenists.
The Jansenists? Who were they again?
They were a strict Catholic movement,
Right.
and they criticized the Jesuits for being too flexible with their morals. They had this idea called probabilism.
Probabilism, what is that?
It basically allowed for some interpretation when it came to moral principles.
Ah, I see. So that could be seen as being a bit too lenient, maybe even relativistic.
Exactly. And the Jansenists really went after them for it.
So you have this growing distrust fueled by political intrigue, internal divisions, and these theological battles. Where does it all lead?
Well, it all culminates in their suppression. The pressure just kept building. First, they were expelled from Portugal, then France, Spain. It just kept snowballing. And finally, in 1773, Pope Clement IV issued a worldwide ban on the Society of Jesus.
Wow. That must have been devastating for them, to go from being this global force to being completely shut down by the Pope himself. What happened to all the individual Jesuits? Were there stories of resilience, or did this completely crush their spirit?
It was a time of tremendous uncertainty. Their libraries were looted, their schools closed down, properties confiscated. A huge cultural and intellectual loss for the church and for the world, really.
It's hard to imagine how they could ever come back from that. So is this the end of the Jesuits? Or did they somehow manage to survive?
Well, just when it seemed like it was all over, there was this one flicker of hope in Russia, Catherine the Great. she refused to enforce the ban.
Catherine the Great, why would she do that?
She had her reasons. But her defiance, it created a safe haven for the Jesuits, allowing them to keep operating, though on a much smaller scale. And it was this tiny group in Russia that would eventually lead to their second founding.
So, from global powerhouse to almost extinct, saved by a loophole in Russia, what a story.
It really is a testament to their resilience and ability to adapt. They clung to that one bit of territory, and when the political winds shifted, they were ready to rebuild. But now they were operating in a world transformed by the French Revolution, facing a whole new set of challenges and a much more conservative outlook.
It's incredible. They faced suppression, exile, near extinction, and yet they endured. It makes you wonder what kept them going, what fueled their spirit during such dark times.
That's a great question. Was it their unwavering faith, their dedication to their mission, or maybe a deep belief in the power of education and service? It's probably a combination of all those things. But their story of survival is truly remarkable.
And it doesn't end there. They're back in the game, but the world is a different place. I'm excited to see how they navigated this new landscape and what impact they had on the modern world. But for now, we'll leave it here, on the brink of their second founding, facing a world full of new possibilities. We left off with the Jesuits facing a brand new world after their second founding. But before we get to that, I'm really curious about their missions, especially those in China and Japan. I mean, those were such different cultural landscapes compared to Europe.
Oh, for sure. Their experiences in those places really highlight how complex cultural exchange and religious conversion can be.
Yeah.
Take China, for example. It all started with this Italian Jesuit, Matteo Ricci, back in 1583. He quickly realized that the traditional European missionary playbook just wasn't going to work there.
I can imagine. So what did he do? Did he try to force European customs on the Chinese, or did he try something different?
Ricci was a smart guy. He realized he needed a new approach, a strategy of accommodation. So he dove headfirst into learning the Chinese language and customs, even dressing like a Confucian scholar.
Wow, he really went all in.
He did. He knew the Chinese valued knowledge and scholarship. So he used his expertise in math and astronomy to gain access to the imperial court.
So he basically used science to build bridges.
Exactly. He even helped them create more accurate maps, which earned him a lot of respect and trust. But his approach wasn't without its critics. Some within the church weren't happy that he allowed Chinese converts to keep practicing certain Confucian rituals.
But wouldn't banning those rituals have been seen as disrespectful, insensitive to their culture? It sounds like Ricci was trying to find a balance to integrate Christianity into the existing cultural fabric.
That was his goal. But it caused a huge controversy known as the Chinese rights controversy. It raised some really fundamental questions about religious conversion, the limits of adapting to different cultures.
Wow, that's a tough one. So how did the church resolve it? Did they compromise or what?
It was a long and complicated process, went on for decades. Different popes and theologians weighed in, and it was a really heated debate. In the end, the Vatican ended up condemning certain Chinese rites, which created tension and limited the growth of the Jesuit mission in China.
It just shows how these cultural and religious encounters are rarely straightforward. Lots of tough choices, compromises, no easy answers.
Right. And speaking of cultural clashes, let's move on to Japan. The Jesuits landed there in the mid-1500s, led by this incredible figure, Francis Xavier. He was known as the Apostle of the Indies and had this incredible passion for spreading the faith.
Oh, I've heard of him. He seemed fearless, going to all these uncharted territories, facing all kinds of challenges. What was his experience in Japan like?
Initially, he had some success. He managed to convert a number of Japanese people. Some local rulers were actually intrigued by these foreigners and open to what they had to say. But it wasn't long before tensions started brewing.
What happened?
There was political intrigue, suspicion of foreign influence. It's a common theme throughout history, that fear of outsiders.
Yeah, it's sad how often that happens.
Right. And in Japan, it turned into outright persecution. In 1597, 26 Christians, including 3 Japanese Jesuits, were crucified in Nagasaki. A horrific event and a sign of growing hostility towards Christianity.
That's awful. Must have been a turning point for the Jesuits in Japan.
It was. Then, in 1614, all missionaries were kicked out, and Japanese Christians were ordered to give up their faith or face serious consequences. Christianity was basically forced underground for centuries. It was a devastating blow to the Jesuit mission and a tragic example of religious intolerance.
It's so sad to think about those people having to choose between their faith and their safety. Makes you realize how precious religious freedom is and how much people have sacrificed throughout history to protect their beliefs.
Your stories are powerful reminders, that's for sure. reminders of the cost of intolerance, the importance of protecting religious diversity.
So, setbacks in both China and Japan. Those experiences really highlight the challenges of crossing cultures and how unpredictable missions can be. But let's head back to Europe for a minute. We were talking about those controversies and internal struggles that led to their suppression in 1773. Can we dive into those events a little deeper?
Sure, remember that whole thing with the fake manual, the moneta secreta? That, along with other accusations, painted this picture of the Jesuits as power-hungry and manipulative, eroding trust among European rulers.
They were caught in a web of intrigue, it seems. Were those accusations totally baseless, or was there some truth to them?
The moneta secreta was completely made up, meant to damage their reputation. But their political involvement, their global network, it did make them a target for people who felt threatened.
It's like their success was both a blessing and a curse.
It was. Brought them influence, but also made them vulnerable. And then there was the Jansenist controversy.
Right, that theological debate about their approach to morals.
Exactly. They were criticized for this concept of probabilism, which allowed for some flexibility in interpreting moral rules.
I can see how that could be misconstrued as moral relativism. How did the Jansenists use this to attack them?
They accused the Jesuits of being too lax, of watering down moral principles for convenience. Pascal, in his Lettres Provinciales, he wrote this brilliant but very cutting satire, ridiculing their moral flexibility and further tarnishing their image.
So it was a mix of political intrigue, theological debates, and a smear campaign that ultimately led to their downfall.
A perfect storm, you could say. The Jansenists, along with other opponents of the society, they teamed up with influential figures in the French court.
The French court. Always a hub for scheming.
Right. And they used this financial scandal involving a Jesuit named Antoine Lavalette to push for the suppression of the order in France.
So they were exploiting these controversies to weaken the Jesuits, like a chess game with the fate of an entire religious order at stake.
Exactly. And they were successful. In 1762, the Jesuits were expelled from France, their property seized, schools shut down, and they were forced into exile.
That was a major blow. France was a center of Jesuit intellectual life. What happened to them after they were expelled?
It was like a domino effect. Other European countries, pressured by anti-Jesuit factions, they followed suit. Spain, Portugal, even the Kingdom of Naples.
Yeah.
All expelled the Jesuits.
Wow, so they're getting squeezed from all sides. What about the Pope during all this? Was he just watching it all happen?
Pope Clement XIII. He was actually sympathetic to the Jesuits. He tried to shield them, but he was facing intense pressure from these powerful monarchs.
He must have been in a tough spot.
He was. Supporting the Jesuits meant risking a major clash with some of Europe's most important rulers.
Tough choice. So what happened?
Well, Clement XIII died,
Huh.
and the pressure on his successor, Clement IV, it was even more intense.
So he was basically backed into a corner.
Pretty much. He tried to stall, hoping things would change, but the pressure was relentless. Finally, in 1773, he issued a papal brief called Dominus Ac Redemptor. It abolished the Society of Jesus worldwide.
What a dramatic fall from grace, from the most influential religious order to being completely shut down by the Pope. How did the Jesuits deal with this?
They were dispersed, scattered. Some fled into exile, some joined other orders, some just went back to secular life. Their property was taken, their schools closed, their libraries plundered.
It seemed like the end of an era. After such a downfall, how could they possibly recover?
Well, remember Catherine the Great of Russia?
The one who refused to enforce the ban?
Yes. Her defiance was a tiny spark of hope for the Jesuits. In Russia, of all places, the seeds of their eventual comeback were planted.
So the Jesuits, pushed to the brink, find refuge in Russia. It's like something out of a movie. What happened next? Did they just lay low and wait it out?
Catherine let them operate in her territory. They even got permission to open a novitiate, which meant they could train new recruits. This small group in Russia, they became the heart of the society's revival.
So they're hanging on, barely, but they're still alive.
It's a testament to their resilience, their ability to adapt and survive. And then in 1814, something incredible happened. The political landscape shifted in Europe, and Pope Pius VII, in a complete reversal, issued a bull restoring the Society of Jesus worldwide.
Hold on. The Pope who banned them was gone, and a new Pope brings them back. That's amazing. Did anyone see that coming?
It was a huge surprise, a total turnaround. After decades of suppression, the Jesuits were suddenly back in the game.
What a comeback. But they were returning to a different world. The 19th century was a time of huge social and political upheaval. The French Revolution had changed everything, and you had new ideologies like liberalism and nationalism on the rise. How did the Jesuits handle this new world order?
It was a mixed bag, really. both opportunity and challenge. On one hand, the Catholic Church was experiencing a resurgence, and the Jesuits were eager to reclaim their role as educators and missionaries. But it was a more diverse world, and often a hostile one.
So they were walking a tightrope between tradition and modernity. How did they navigate this new landscape?
Well, one of their main priorities was to rebuild their educational network. They knew education was crucial for shaping the minds of future generations, for countering the growing influence of secularism. They founded new schools and universities, brought back their rigorous curriculum, basically picked up where they left off.
Sounds like they were determined to reclaim their place as leaders in education. And I'm guessing it wasn't as easy as just dusting off the old books and going back to business as usual. How did their approach to education change in this new era?
The intellectual landscape had changed. Modern science was challenging old views, and Latin wasn't the main language of scholarship anymore. Those were big changes for an order that was so rooted in classical learning.
So, did they embrace these new developments, or did they stick to their traditional methods?
It's fascinating they did a bit of both. They knew they had to include modern subjects in their curriculum, so there's a growing focus on science, math, modern languages. But they also stuck to those core values of humanistic education, emphasizing critical thinking, moral formation, a solid foundation in the classics.
This seems to be a recurring theme with the Jesuits, balancing their core identity with embracing new ideas. What were the risks of this approach? Could it create conflict within the order?
Definitely a risk. That tension between tradition and innovation has been a source of strength, but also friction throughout their history.
So they're rebuilding schools, adapting to modern scholarship. What about their missions? Did that evolve in the 19th and 20th centuries?
It did. The 19th century was a time of huge imperial expansion. European powers were spreading their empires all over the world, and the Jesuits saw this as a chance to spread the Catholic faith to new territories.
So they're riding this wave of European expansion, bringing Christianity to new corners of the world.
Exactly. They established missions in Africa, Asia, the Americas. They were truly pioneers, learning new languages, immersing themselves in different cultures. And they often faced incredible hardships.
I'm noticing a pattern. The Jesuits seem to always be pushing boundaries, looking for new challenges, even if it means putting themselves in danger.
They were definitely driven by a deep sense of mission, this belief that they were called to spread the gospel to everyone. And it wasn't just about converting people, it was also about education, healthcare, social justice.
So their mission was intertwined with these broader humanitarian goals.
Absolutely. They were setting up schools, hospitals, and poor communities, fighting for the rights of indigenous people, speaking out against injustice.
So they weren't just preaching the gospel, they were living it out, putting their faith into action.
Yes, and their commitment to social justice often put them in conflict with powerful forces. Remember those Jesuit martyrs in El Salvador? They were killed for speaking out against the government and defending the rights of the poor. Right. A sobering reminder that their work wasn't always welcomed and that they were willing to risk everything for their beliefs. Their story is a mix of incredible achievements and real tragedy. But let's not forget those internal struggles. We talked about the conflict with Pope Paul VI over their involvement in liberation theology and social justice. Did those tensions continue?
To some degree, yes. The Jesuits' commitment to social justice often put them at odds with more conservative elements in the church. There were debates over their role in politics, their stance on moral issues, even their interpretation of Vatican II.
So they were still shaking things up, pushing boundaries.
They were. And then, of course, you have the election of Pope Francis in 2013.
Yeah.
The first Jesuit pope in history.
That was a huge moment, a Jesuit pope. I wonder if those early Jesuits back in Paris ever imagined that one of their own would one day lead the church.
It's incredible to think about. Pope Francis has brought a renewed focus on social justice, interfaith dialogue, and a more humble, inclusive style of leadership.
He's definitely changing things, and I'm guessing the Jesuits are fully on board, supporting his agenda for reform.
Absolutely. There's a lot of excitement and a sense of possibility within the order. They feel like they're playing a key role in shaping the church's future.
So we've gone from near extinction to a Jesuit pope. That's an incredible journey. But what does it all mean for someone listening, someone trying to understand the Jesuits and their impact?
I think their story gives us a window into how faith, power, and social change all interact. It's a reminder that even the oldest institutions are always evolving, and that individuals and groups can make a huge difference, even when faced with tremendous challenges.
Their story isn't over. They're still out there, teaching, serving, advocating for a more just and compassionate world. And who knows what the future holds, especially with the Jesuit Pope leading the way. We've covered a lot of ground, from the Jesuits' origins to their near disappearance, their revival, and now a Jesuit Pope. But before we wrap things up, let's dig a little deeper into those 19th and 20th centuries, a time of massive global shifts.
It was a period of incredible achievements, but also a lot of soul-searching internal struggles. They were grappling with their place in a rapidly changing world, facing tough questions about modernity, social justice, and their own identity.
Right. We were talking about how they were rebuilding their schools, their whole educational network. They saw education as this crucial tool, especially with the rise of secularism.
Education was always at the heart of their mission. They poured their energy into those schools and universities, seeing them as essential for shaping young minds, transmitting values. But it wasn't just about memorization or, blindly following tradition. They emphasized critical thinking and developing a moral compass, along with rigorous academics.
But the world was changing fast. Modern science was challenging old ways of thinking, and Latin wasn't the dominant language of scholarship anymore. How did they reconcile their classical approach with all these shifts?
It was a balancing act, for sure. They had to adapt, which wasn't always easy for an order so deeply rooted in tradition. They started incorporating modern subjects, science, math, modern languages into their curriculum.
So they were modernizing.
To a degree. But they didn't abandon those humanistic roots. They still believed that education should develop the whole person, not just fill their heads with facts.
So, striking that balance again, holding on to the old while bringing in the new. But was it enough to stay relevant in such a rapidly changing world?
It was a constant struggle. They faced criticism from both sides. Traditionalists thought they were too progressive, and modernists thought they weren't progressive enough. They were walking this tightrope, trying to be true to themselves while also responding to the needs of a changing world.
It sounds exhausting, trying to please everyone. Did all this effort to modernize create any tension within their ranks?
Oh, absolutely. There were lots of internal debates and disagreements about how to best adapt. Some argued for, a more radical embrace of change, while others urged caution, a more gradual approach. That tension between preserving their identity and evolving, it's a constant thread in their history.
Seems like a lot of their story is about navigating these tensions, finding that sweet spot between seemingly opposing forces. So, while they were grappling with these educational reforms in Europe, their missions were also taking on new dimensions. We talked about how they spread out to Africa, Asia, the Americas during that age of imperialism. But was their approach to missionary work changing too?
It was definitely evolving. They still believed in spreading the gospel, but their methods were becoming more nuanced. They were placing more emphasis on really understanding local cultures, learning languages, building genuine relationships.
So it was less about imposing their beliefs and more about building bridges.
Exactly. And they were getting more and more involved in social justice work, too.
So it wasn't just about converting people to Christianity. It was about actually making their lives better in tangible ways.
Right. They were founding schools and hospitals in impoverished communities, defending the rights of indigenous peoples, often exploited under colonial rule, and speaking out against oppression wherever they saw it.
For someone who's been listening to our deep dive into Jesuit history, would you say this is a continuation of those core values that Ignatius of Loyola emphasized, education and service? Or was it something totally new, a response to the unique challenges of this era?
It's both, really. Those core values were still driving them, but they were being applied in new ways, new contexts. It shows their ability to adapt and meet the needs of the time. That's a big part of their resilience.
Their work in these missions wasn't always easy, though. We talked about the Jesuit martyrs in El Salvador killed for their social justice work. Were there other times when they faced resistance or persecution?
Sadly, yes. They often found themselves caught in the middle of political conflicts, especially in Latin America, where their advocacy for social justice was seen as a threat by those in power.
So their commitment to justice wasn't just theoretical. They were willing to put themselves at risk, to face real danger, to stand up for their beliefs.
Absolutely. And their activism wasn't limited to those faraway missions. Back in Europe, they were involved in heated debates within the church itself. We talked about that tension with Pope Paul VI over liberation theology and their involvement in those social justice movements.
Right. Some people thought they were too radical, too focused on worldly issues.
Yes, there were accusations of them being too political, too aligned with leftist movements, and of straying from traditional church teachings.
It seems like they were always pushing the envelope, challenging the status quo. Do you think that was a fundamental part of who they were?
I think so. They weren't afraid to ask tough questions, to wrestle with complex issues, to speak truth to power, and sometimes that meant challenging the very structures they were part of.
That takes courage to stand up for what you believe in, even when it means going against the grain, risking rejection from your own community.
It does. And their story is a good reminder that progress isn't always smooth or comfortable. It involves disagreements, setbacks, and even sacrifices sometimes.
So, as we get to the end of the 20th century, the Jesuits are still figuring things out, trying to find their place in a world that's constantly changing. And then, boom, a Jesuit becomes Pope.
A real turning point. It felt like a culmination of their long and complex journey.
So, what might someone listening take away from Pope Francis's papacy, knowing his Jesuit background? How might that shape his approach to issues like social justice or church reform?
Well, his papacy has really emphasized social justice, interfaith dialogue, and a more humble, inclusive approach to leadership. He's not afraid to challenge the way things are done, to speak out against injustice, even if it ruffles some feathers.
He seems to embody a lot of those core Jesuit values we've been discussing. A passion for education, a commitment to service, and a willingness to grapple with the messy realities of the modern world.
He does.
Right.
And his election has brought a lot of hope and excitement to the Jesuit order. They see him as someone who understands them, someone who supports their mission to make a positive impact.
So, from almost disappearing to having a Jesuit pope, what a story. It's been an incredible journey exploring their history with you.
It has. They've faced incredible challenges, from suppression to near extinction, and yet they've accomplished so much. Pioneering new educational models, fighting for social justice.
It's a story that teaches us about resilience, adaptability, and the importance of staying true to your values, no matter what obstacles you face.
And it reminds us that history is complicated, full of contradictions and unexpected turns.
And as for the Jesuits, their journey isn't over. They're still out there teaching, serving, working for a better world. Who knows what the future holds, especially with a Jesuit pope leading the Catholic Church. It's an exciting time for them, full of possibilities. And on that note, we'll leave you to reflect on the incredible legacy of the Jesuits. We hope this deep dive has shed some light on their fascinating and complex history.